Welcome back to True Crime Trolls. In this episode, we will look at the thrilling story of the Green River Killer. At the end of the story, the rain will continue to help you sleep. Get cozy and enjoy. It was the summer of 1982, and Seattle was shrouded in a heavy, unrelenting mist. The city, still awakening from its slumber, was unaware that a nightmare was about to unfold. For 16-year-old Wendy Lee Caulfield, it was just another night. She was a runaway, one of many young women who had drifted into the city's underbelly, where the streets were cruel and unforgiving. Wendy had grown accustomed to the dangers of the night. Unsavory men, drug deals gone wrong, the constant threat of violence. But tonight felt different. There was a presence in the air, something dark and menacing, something that watched her every move. The man who followed Wendy that night was no ordinary predator. He was a hunter, a man whose twisted desires had been festering for years. His name was Gary Ridgway, but the world would soon come to know him as the Green River Killer. Ridgway was a master of deception. With his unassuming appearance and calm demeanor, he could disarm even the wariest of women. Wendy, desperate to escape, felt a momentary relief as Ridgway approached. He didn't look like a threat, just another man offering a ride, a quick escape from the dangers of the night. "You look lost. Need a ride? I can get you out of here." But as Wendy climbed into Ridgway's truck, she unknowingly sealed her fate. For Ridgway, this was not a simple act of kindness. It was the beginning of a ritual, one that would repeat itself dozens of times over the next 2 decades. As Ridgway drove deeper into the night, the facade of normalcy began to crumble. Wendy sensed the change. The air grew colder, the road more desolate. She was no longer in control, and the man beside her was no longer a stranger offering a ride. He was a predator, and she was his prey. Ridgway's heart pounded with anticipation as he parked near the Green River. This was his hunting ground, a place where he could indulge in his darkest fantasies without fear of discovery. He turned to Wendy, his expression devoid of emotion, and pulled out the rope he had carefully prepared. Wendy fought with everything she had, but Ridgway's strength was overwhelming. His hands closed around her throat. The terror in her eyes only fueled his sadistic pleasure, and within minutes, it was over. Wendy Lee Caulfield was dead. For Ridgway, this was only the beginning. The thrill of the kill, the power he felt as he took another life, was intoxicating. But the true satisfaction would come later, when he disposed of the body, erasing any trace of his crime. Ridgway had chosen the Green River for a reason. It was a place where the currents could carry away his sins, where the water could cleanse the evidence of his brutality. He dragged Wendy's body through the underbrush, each step calculated, each movement precise. Ridgway knew how to cover his tracks. He stripped Wendy of anything that could identify her, anything that could lead back to him. The Green River would take care of the rest, swallowing her body and carrying it downstream, where it would be found days later by a horrified passerby. As Wendy's body disappeared into the murky waters of the Green River, Ridgway felt a sense of calm wash over him. The act was complete, the evidence gone. He was safe, at least for now, and with the taste of blood still fresh in his mouth, he knew it wouldn't be long before he returned to this place, to this river, to kill as Ridgway drove away from the river. He glanced in his rearview mirror. expecting to see the ghostly image of Wendy staring back at him. The dark road behind him was empty, but the sensation of being followed was overwhelming. He turned up the radio, trying to drown out the silence, but no song could silence the voice, whispering in his mind, urging him to kill again. Ridgway didn't stop after Wendy. Her murder was the beginning of a horrifying spree. In the weeks following her death, Ridgway began planning his next moves. He knew that, to avoid detection, he had to be careful, but the thrill of the hunt was too enticing to resist. He spent hours alone in his dimly lit home, staring at maps of the Seattle area, marking potential dumping sites. His mind was a labyrinth of twisted thoughts, each darker than the last. The more he planned, the more detached from reality he became. He was creating a world where he was the predator and everyone else was prey. At night, he dreamed of the Green River, its waters thick with the souls of the women he would soon claim. In his dreams, the river whispered to him, promising him power and control if he continued to feed it. On the surface, he appeared to be a regular working man, holding a steady job as a truck painter at Kenworth Truck Company. His co-workers and family saw nothing unusual about him. He was a man of habits. Blending into society, on the morning of December 3rd, Ridgway awoke before dawn. The cold winter air seeped through the walls of his modest home, but he didn't notice. He was already focused, his mind occupied with the dark thoughts that had become all too familiar. As he dressed, he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror, a nondescript man with dead eyes. He practiced his smile, the one that put others at ease, the one that hid the monster within. Before leaving for work, Ridgway made a small adjustment to his routine. He placed a coil of rope in the back of his truck, making sure it was hidden under a pile of rags. He knew he would need it later. Ridgway's job often took him to different parts of the Seattle area, providing the perfect cover for his activities. He used his workday as an opportunity to scout for potential victims, driving through areas known for prostitution. As the afternoon wore on, Ridgway's thoughts drifted away from work and toward the hunt. He drove slowly through the rain-soaked streets, his eyes scanning the sidewalks for vulnerable women. The December sky was a dull gray, the kind of weather that made the city seem even more oppressive. Ridgway felt a thrill as he spotted a young woman standing alone under a flickering street lamp. He pulled over and rolled down the window, offering her a ride. She hesitated, but his practiced charm won her over. As she climbed into the truck, Ridgway's heart raced, not with fear, but with anticipation. The hunt was over. Now it was time for the kill. As night fell, Ridgway drove to a remote spot near the Green River, a place he had scouted many times before. The woman grew uneasy as the surroundings became more isolated, but by then, it was too late. Ridgway parked the truck and turned to her, his expression void of the kindness he had shown earlier. With the speed and precision of a predator, he attacked, wrapping the rope around her neck. She struggled, her eyes wide with terror, but Ridgway was stronger. The sound of her gasping for breath filled the air, a sound that would haunt the place long after she was gone. As life left her body, Ridgway felt a dark satisfaction. This was what he lived for, the moment when he held complete power over another human being. After killing his victims, Ridgway often disposed of their bodies near the Green River or in other remote locations, believing that the water would wash away any evidence. Under the cover of darkness, Ridgway carried the woman's lifeless body to the edge of the river. The water was cold, its surface barely visible in the dim light of the crescent moon. As he dropped her into the river, he watched as the current began to carry her away, the water slowly pulling her under. But this time, something felt different. As Ridgway stared into the dark water, he thought he saw movement, a shadow beneath the surface. For a moment, he imagined a hand reaching up, trying to pull him in. He took a step back, shaken, but quickly dismissed it as his imagination. He had nothing to fear from the dead. Ridgway left the riverbank, but the unease lingered. The drive home was silent. The radio turned off. The familiar satisfaction of a successful kill was tainted by the memory of that shadow in the water, a reminder that the river was not just a dumping ground, but something more, a place where the spirits of the women he had killed might linger, waiting for their revenge. Back at home, he washed the blood from his hands, scrubbing harder than usual. The water in the sink turned pink, swirling down the drain like the river's current. As he lay in bed that night, Ridgway struggled to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that shadow in the water, felt the cold hand reaching for him. As the body count rose, Ridgway became increasingly reckless. The murders were becoming routine, almost mechanical, but the pressure of maintaining his double life was taking its toll. He began making mistakes, leaving behind evidence and drawing closer to being caught. He tried to silence the voices by killing more frequently, but it only made them louder. The faces of his victims haunted him, appearing in the mirrors of his home, in the reflections of the windows of his truck. The world around him seemed to warp, reality blending with his nightmares. He couldn't tell where the dream ended and the real world began. As the Green River Killer continued his reign of terror, leaving a trail of bodies across the Seattle area, the police were under immense pressure to catch the elusive murderer. By 1983, the investigation was in full swing, but despite their best efforts, Gary Ridgway remained one step ahead of the law. However, the net was slowly closing in, and suspicion would eventually turn toward him. As the bodies continued to pile up, the task force felt the weight of public and political pressure bearing down on them. Each new victim was a reminder of their failure to catch the killer, and frustration within the department was growing. There were rumors among the detectives that the killer might be someone they had already spoken to, someone who had slipped through their fingers. First time Ridgway was called in for questioning, he remained eerily calm. He had prepared for this moment, knowing that it was only a matter of time before the police came knocking. He walked into the station with the air of an innocent man, his demeanor friendly and helpful. The detectives couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about him, something they couldn't quite put their finger on. During the interview, Ridgway was careful with his words, offering just enough information to seem cooperative without giving anything away. He explained his presence in the areas frequented by the victims as mere coincidence. He worked nearby, after all. The detectives asked him about his relationships with the women he had been seen with, and Ridgway downplayed them, insisting they were brief encounters, nothing more. As the interview went on, one of the detectives noticed something unsettling in Ridgway's eyes, an emptiness, as if he were wearing a mask of normalcy that didn't quite fit. But without solid evidence, they would have no choice but to let him go. So they insisted he take a polygraph test to prove his innocence. As Ridgway sat down for the polygraph test, he focused on keeping his breathing steady, his heart rate controlled. He knew that this test could be his undoing if he wasn't careful. The questions came, probing his involvement with the victims, his whereabouts, his habits. With each answer, Ridgway forced himself to stay calm, his mind detaching from the reality of what he had done. The machine recorded his responses, but the examiner couldn't detect any signs of deceit. Ridgway's ability to compartmentalize his emotions, to shut off any sense of guilt or fear, allowed him to pass the test with flying colors. When it was over, the detectives were left with more questions than answers. How could someone so seemingly ordinary, so composed, be capable of such horrific crimes? Although Ridgway passed the polygraph test, some members of the task force still harbored doubts about him. His name was kept on a list of potential suspects, but without stronger evidence. The investigation continued to focus on other leads. Ridgway's ability to blend into society and maintain the appearance of a normal life made it difficult for the police to see him for what he really was, a cold-blooded killer. As the months passed, Ridgway's name continued to surface in the task force's discussions. Some detectives couldn't shake the feeling that they had let the real killer slip through their grasp. They argued about his case, about the polygraph test, and whether they should take another look at him. But without new evidence, there was little they could do. One detective, in particular, seasoned veteran with a gut feeling that Ridgway was hiding something, kept pushing to keep him on the radar. He began to quietly dig into Ridgway's past, looking for anything that might tie him to the murders. The detective couldn't prove it yet, but in his mind, Ridgway was the one they were looking for. Ridgway was aware that he was under suspicion, but his confidence in his ability to outsmart the police kept him from making any serious mistakes. He continued to kill, though he was careful to vary his methods and dumping sites to avoid creating a pattern that could be traced back to him. Despite his outward calm, Ridgway couldn't shake the feeling that the police were watching him. He began to notice cars that seemed to follow him, faces in the crowd that seemed too familiar. His paranoia grew, but he couldn't stop killing. The compulsion was too strong, the need too overwhelming. Ridgway began to alter his routine, taking different routes to work, changing the places where he hunted for victims. He started to feel trapped, like a predator being stalked by an unseen hunter. The thrill of the kill was still there, but now it was accompanied by a gnawing fear that his time was running out. As the years went on, the police continued to circle closer to Ridgway, unaware that the man they sought was the same unassuming person they had questioned and released. Ridgway continued to live his double life, but the walls were closing in. He knew that one day the mask would slip and the police would see him for what he truly was. Until then, he remained a ghost, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the day when his luck would finally run out. By the late 1990s, DNA technology had advanced significantly, allowing law enforcement to re-examine old evidence with new techniques. In 2001, detectives revisited the Green River Killer case, focusing on biological samples that had been collected from some of the victims in the early 1980s. The detectives, who had worked the Green River case for years, had never given up hope, even as the trail grew colder. In 2001, with new DNA testing methods available, they decided to reanalyze the evidence they had gathered from the crime scenes. It was a last-ditch effort, a shot in the dark, but they knew that this might be their final chance to catch the killer who had eluded them for so long. The samples were sent to the lab, and the waiting began. Days turned into weeks, and then finally, the call came. The DNA from several of the victims matched a single profile, a profile that belonged to Gary Ridgway. The detectives could hardly believe it. After nearly 2 decades, they had their man. On November 30th, 2001, police went to the Kenworth truck factory, where Gary had worked for over 30 years. Before he could react, they moved in, surrounding him. Ridgway's heart pounded as they approached, their faces grim. The lead detective stepped forward and informed him that he was under arrest for the murders of multiple women. For the first time in years, Ridgway felt true fear. The game was over. As Ridgway sat in a holding cell, his mind raced. He knew that the police would be tearing through his house, searching for any evidence that could link him to the crimes. He had always been careful, but he couldn't shake the fear that they would find something he had missed. The detectives arrived at his modest home in Auburn, Washington, armed with a search warrant and a team of forensics experts. As they entered, they were struck by how ordinary the house seemed. It was neat, tidy, the home of a man who took care of his belongings. But they knew that behind this facade lay the dark secrets of one of the most prolific serial killers in history. The search began, and room by room, they combed through his possessions. In the garage, they found ropes and ligatures that matched the types used in some of the murders. In a hidden compartment in his closet, they uncovered small trinkets and jewelry, keepsakes taken from his victims as trophies. Each discovery was another nail in Ridgway's coffin, another piece of the puzzle that confirmed his guilt. In the basement, they found something even more chilling: maps and notes detailing the locations of some of the bodies, evidence that Ridgway had kept track of his gruesome deeds. The detectives couldn't help but feel a cold dread as they realized how methodical and calculating Ridgway had been, keeping records of his kills as if they were trophies. After his arrest, Ridgway was subjected to intense interrogation. Initially, he denied involvement in the murders, but as the evidence mounted, he realized that his only chance to avoid the death penalty was to cooperate with the authorities. Over the course of several months, Ridgway confessed to the murders of 71 women. Though he admitted that the actual number might be higher, the detective listened in silence, his stomach churning as Ridgway described the murders with a chilling detachment. There was no remorse, no regret, only a cold recounting of the facts. As Ridgway spoke, the detective realized that this was not just a man confessing to his crimes. This was a monster revealing his true self. Ridgway's arrest and subsequent confessions shocked the nation. He was eventually convicted of 49 murders, though he confessed to killing more than 70 women. In exchange for his cooperation in locating the remains of his victims, Ridgway was spared the death penalty and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.